Hello again, Year 13. It's been a while, I know, you've missed me, here I am, it's all going to be okay. Now, when I last emailed you, we were finishing off evaluation of John Finnis, and we decided we'd wait to go on to the application of his updated version of natural law in order to look at Hus and proportionalism first. So that's what we're going to start today, and then we'll apply both of those to the relevant issues a little further down the line. I've emailed out the worksheet on Hus and proportionalism, which looks like this, and so we're going to fill in only probably this first third today. I'm not going to try and do everything. The other sections we'll do all together later next time, but I want to get the basics first and understand where this is coming from, and then we'll go into the nitty-gritty of these different types, which are quite easy to get confused, but that's just the way of it, really. So, we're starting with some background to this proportionalism from Bernard Hus, so we're going to talk context here. And the very first thing to say is that, rather annoyingly, Bernard Hus is not really someone we can call a proportionalist. Okay? Now, one of the things I love about this particular topic is Bernard Hus's name, because I get to say Hus, which amuses me no end, because I'm sad like that. But, annoyingly, I can't tell you that Hus is a proportionalist. And in fact, the exam board themselves recognized this, and they altered their spec last year. And so, originally it was proportionalism from Bernard Hus. Now it is Bernard Hus's overview of the proportionalist debate. And the reason for that, quite simply, is that Bernard Hus is not necessarily a proportionalist himself, but he wrote a book about proportionalism. And in this book, called Proportionalism, the American Debate and its European Roots, this is in 1987, he basically gave an overview and commented on the whole proportionalist phenomenon, while never actually clearly stating his own views. So we're going to talk about proportionalism as explained by Bernard Hus, but not necessarily stating that Hus is a proportionalist, because we don't know that's the case. Okay, so annoying bit of context for you there. The other thing to understand about where proportionalism came from, it did arise from Roman Catholic scholarship, but it is actually not accepted by the Roman Catholic Church officially. Similar to with John Finnis's approach to natural law, there were a number of thinkers in the Roman Catholic Church who felt that natural law had become perhaps too legalistic, too rigid a framework, and that sometimes natural law, as outlined by Aquinas, didn't always perhaps give the best moral results. As a result, then they came up with this idea of proportionalism, which bases itself on Aquinas' natural law, but then it makes one or two significant alterations. Unfortunately, those alterations were simply too severe for the Roman Catholic Church officially to accept, and so it to this day states that proportionalism is not Catholic Church doctrine. But there are still many who think that it has, a lot to commend itself. So we'll have a look and see what we can make of it. If you have your revision guide, then we're on page, oh goodness knows, page something or other, 12 I think it is, gets you start of proportionalism. And I'm not going to read through all this, but you can have a closer look. You'll note here, though, influential commentator of proportionalism was Bernard Hus, who summarized the theory rather than actually necessarily following it himself. And as we said, a concern from some theologians is that ethics in the Catholic tradition were too deontologically rigid, okay? And so perhaps, maybe even having moved a little bit too far away from what Aquinas himself was aiming for, we had the primary precepts, and from that you were supposed to draw the secondary precepts depending on different situations. However, because of the sort of emphasis placed on the primary precepts and not breaking those or undermining them, the secondary precepts essentially became a very strong rule system, and some felt that wasn't really the way it was meant to be. But proportionalism has been condemned by the Catholic Church, so they're not big fans. Interestingly, you can see perhaps evidence or approaches to proportionalism even back in the work of St. Thomas Aquinas. If you look at Aquinas, then he points out that you have your primary precepts, and you should, of course, follow those, and you should perform actions that support them. But there are occasions where there seems to be something of a conflict between them. For example, we have the primary precept of living in an ordered society, so you shouldn't steal. On the other hand, you have the precept of preserving life. And when you have, say, a starving child, who might need to steal in order to survive, you have a clash between these two precepts. And Aquinas used that example and said that it was acceptable for the child to steal food in order to live to uphold that precept. However, although Aquinas said that this was acceptable, and it suggests that there were circumstances where you could weigh up one precept against another, he didn't actually say that this was something that could be applied to all situations. For example, he didn't give the example that you could lie in order to save someone's life. That wasn't considered to be acceptable. So you have this sort of possible principle alluded to by Aquinas, but never outright stated. But it's that idea that proportionalism looks to and tries to sort of build on. Okay? So proportionalists would say they are drawing from the work of Aquinas, even if he didn't quite lay it out in those terms. And that example, by the way, is right here in your vision guide. Okay? Now, Hus points out what the proportionalists have done is point out the inconsistency and invalidity of this thinking for Aquinas. So a person who's starving to death can steal to save their life, but telling a lie to save someone from death is not acceptable. That doesn't seem very consistent. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So that's where we're coming in with proportionalism. First thing to note is that proportionalism is predominantly considered a teleological theory, although not entirely. On the worksheet here it mentions a hybrid theory. We'll come to that in the future, but essentially it combines teleological and deontological elements. Overall, however, Hus says it is predominantly teleological. But it begins, as Aquinas does, with the primary precepts. And proportionalists say, yep, the primary precepts are good. The primary precepts give us a very good moral guide to follow, and actually, in most circumstances, following the primary precepts is the right thing to do. So to begin with, proportionalism looks a lot like Aquinas' natural law. We have the same 5 primary precepts, and we follow them. However, what proportionalists do is suggest, as Hus has sort of outlined here, that there may be times when there is a good enough reason to justify going against a primary precept or breaking a primary precept to serve another situation. In other words, as Hus puts it, it is never right to go against a principle unless there is a proportionate reason which would justify it. If there is a proportionate reason, then you may need to break or ignore one of the primary precepts. That essentially is the key difference brought in by proportionalism. Now, in order to understand what would make something a proportionate reason, you need to look at 3 things. And looking down here at proportionate reason, we've got SIC. Remember the sick. Now, sadly, we're not in the classroom here, because what I normally do when I'm teaching this is I tell the students about how sick I am and how down with the youth I am, probably with some sort of, youthful pose demonstrating my hipness. And when I do this and say, remember the sick, because I am sick, my students cringe physically, and nothing brings me greater joy than watching my students physically cringe, which is why I will state, remember the sick, as many times as I can, to make them cringe, and also because you then won't forget it. Sadly, I can't do that here, so you're just going to have to imagine me doing that, and then cringe in your own time. Okay? And I hope that you will every time that I tell you to remember the sick. Now, SIC, S-I-C, stands for the situation. So consider, actually, what is the moral dilemma, as it were? What is the circumstances of this moral choice? What is the situation? We need to consider the intentions of the moral agent. What is it they are actually aiming to achieve? And we need to consider the consequences of the action, of what will follow. And the fact, of course, we're talking about consequences is why this theory is very teleological. So when you're looking for a proportionate reason why you might need to suspend or ignore one of the primary precepts, you remember the sick. What's the situation? What are the intentions of the moral agent? And what will be the consequences of the action? And if, weighing those things up, you think there is a proportionate reason to justify breaking one of the primary precepts, then you would do so. And that, of course, is the key change compared to natural law. Now, you can argue, and in fact many do, that you can see this approach even in Aquinas' law of double effect. We noticed that there are times, for Aquinas, when through double effect you might perform an action that under other circumstances might just seem to be wrong. Of course, you're not intending to do something wrong, where the intention comes in, but the side effect, the double effect of your action would normally be considered wrong. We used the example previously of a pregnant woman with cancer. She chooses to undergo cancer treatment, which is a good action because she's going to be helping, save her own life, and she is intending to be cured of cancer. But as a side effect, the unborn child will die. Now, of course, you can't have an abortion, but in this case, the double effect is the unintended consequence. Well, there's a similar idea going on with proportionate reason, in saying actually the intentions and consequences should be considered. We don't necessarily need quite all the sort of technicality of double effect, but it's the similar kind of idea we've got going on here. So what we have then with proportionalism is the same start as Aquinas. We have our 5 primary precepts that in most circumstances will be followed, but there will be occasions where these situations, intentions of the moral agent, and consequences of the action might give us a proportionate reason to justify breaking or ignoring one of the primary precepts and deviating from them. It is only if there is a proportionate reason that this can be done, because in any other circumstance, we should follow natural law deontologically. And for most proportionalists, that's what they would be doing most of the time. These situations where there's a proportionate reason to break one of the deontological primary precepts would probably be relatively rare. Okay? So, as an edited revision guide, what this means is that moral agents should always follow the teleological rules, as the Catholic Church would suggest, unless there's a unique moral situation, and again, that's going to be relatively rare. Okay? So, we follow that maxim. It is never right to go against a principle unless there is a proportionate reason which would justify it. Remember the sick situation, intention, and consequences which might give us a reason. Okay? That gives us the basic premise and the context of proportionalism, and the overarching idea of the theory is present right there. Of course, there is a little bit more to it, what we might call the technicality, the nitty-gritty, and that's what we're going to look at next time with the good and right act and the premoral onto evil / immoral, evil moral act. Okay? And we'll talk a bit more about this hybrid theory idea. But the important thing is to get the basic overview. So if you've got that clear and you've got that filled in, that's great. If you do have any questions, of course, then please do email me. But when I speak to you next time, we will look at the rest. You may want to read ahead a bit to start getting a feel for these. That's probably quite advisable because it's easy to mix these ideas up. So if you get the chance to read ahead, please do so. Otherwise, I will speak to you soon. Take care for now.